I now welcome the Honourable Kevin Rudd, 26th Prime Minister of Australia. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Kevin Michael Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. I invite you to give us a short opening statement and then we're going to go to some questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. And can I say to all senators who are members of this inquiry, I thank you for your combined effort in what I regard to be a deeply important matter for the future of our democracy. It's also the view of the more than 500,000 Australians who signed a petition concerned about the future of media diversity in our country and their interest in a free, fair and balanced media as the continued lifeblood of the Australian democracy, and their contention that that is being undermined by the use and abuse of the emerging and present Murdoch media monopoly. In the next few minutes, if I could simply touch on 4 or 5 quick points. The first is, when we are dealing with the most recent development concerning the reporting by Sky News of the pandemic, we are brought face to face with the fundamental question as to who calls the shots in the Murdoch media empire. Now, from the public reporting, we know that your committee has invited Lachlan Murdoch to attend, and he's declined. And instead, we've just heard from Mr Whittaker. Mr Whittaker's contention is, and I took a note of what he said, is that Mr Murdoch does not influence directly Sky News. Again, I would challenge that for the simple reason that Lachlan Murdoch himself, in the very year that Mr Whittaker took over as CEO of Sky News Australia, said, and Senator Carr's referred to this already, what I do, that's Lachlan Murdoch, running a media organisation, is obviously work closely with the managers of those newsrooms, that means Sky, and with the managers of those newspapers, obviously the digital platforms. And it's important that they, quote, get the positioning and the messaging right, unquote. So in other words, when you've requested Mr Lachlan Murdoch to attend this inquiry, it's not just a matter of colour and movement and interesting journalism and reportage. It's because it goes to the essential nature of the power within the Murdoch media operation and who calls the shots and who dictates the editorial direction of Sky News. So I regard Mr Lachlan Murdoch's non-attendance today as not only deeply disappointing, but frankly utterly spineless, given the power which he wields within the operation. And Mr Whittaker knows that Mr Murdoch wields that power. The second point relates to the most recent controversy about Sky News's coverage and YouTube's response to its reporting on the pandemic. As we all know, this pandemic is the most serious public health crisis we've had in Australia in 100 years. It's not a laughing matter. And when we go to the sort of disinformation that Murdoch Sky News has run across its various platforms in Australia, nor is it a laughing matter. In fact, when you look at just some of the commentary, when we have Sky News out there caught out denying that this is even a pandemic, well, that's false. They've claimed that vaccinated people are much more likely to die from COVID than the unvaccinated. That's false. They've said that the real cures for COVID are livestock wormers and anti-malarial drugs. That's false. They've insisted these miracle cures are being deliberately concealed so that the vaccine manufacturers can experiment on the public. That's false. They say you can't trust state medical authorities because they're all health fascists and that face masks do nothing to inhibit the spread. Well, that's both false and false. And here's the real doozy. They've said that the virus itself may well have been contrived by a group involving the CIA and Bill Gates, possibly with the aim of demolishing capitalism. That's not just false, that's stark raving mad. And so, therefore, when you see that in terms of the reporting and the commentary from Sky News, these are not insignificant claims. They actually contribute to the wider belief in the community by many that vaccines don't work or that the coronavirus pandemic has been overstated and exaggerated. What I found interesting just now, Senators, is that Mr. Whittaker was challenged by one of you as to whether he accepted the accuracy of YouTube's decision that this constituted disinformation. He refused to agree with the proposition that it equaled disinformation. That is the Chief Executive of Sky News Australia not accepting YouTube's determination that what I have just read out equals disinformation. That goes to the heart of the problem. That's the heart of the beast saying it. He further said that, for example, on the quack cures, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, that of course they're not out there in the business of advocacy. Well, again, that's just not true on Mr. Whittaker's part. Let me just quote from Rowan Dean, who said, "The jury is in on hydroxychloroquine, it saves lives," unquote. That's not discussion, that's advocacy. Whereas Mr. Whittaker just told us that they, of course, do no such thing. Senators, it's not just that Sky News, Murdoch's platform in Australia, has put this out there. Part of the reason we're having this debate is that the platform itself is now massively powerful. It's not just watched by a bunch of far right-wing nut jobs late in the evening. It now has a much wider dissemination. That's why Sky has gone onto YouTube, and that's why Sky is now being broadcast on free-to-air television across regional Australia as of 1 August this year. So this disinformation is not just an academic matter. It's out there in the mainstream community. The fact that you've got 9 million views a month, that's Sky's own figure, through their various platforms, is highly significant. The fact that we have 1/3 of those views coming from YouTube is highly significant. 1.3 billion views of Sky content on YouTube over time, double the ABC's, 3 times that of Channel 9, 4 times that of Channel 7. So the overall argument we are contending with here today is it's not only wrong, it's not only inaccurate, it's not only dangerous, it's not only the fact that the Sky CEO doesn't agree with those conclusions, but that it's going right across at least 1/3 of Australians. And therefore Sky News and Murdoch have a case to answer in terms of their complicity in vaccine hesitancy in this country. And that is a public health concern for all of us. And what did it take for this to be exposed and dealt with? It took YouTube and Google to finally blow the whistle, not just once, but twice. Once last December, as Mr. Whittaker has just admitted, and again in July, before 23 at least YouTube videos had to be pulled down. And so the question, again, I believe, for this committee when it goes to the management of media diversity is, what was the Australian Communications and Media Authority, ACMA, doing to earn their salary to allow this to occur? They have a direct responsibility here under the law, because these YouTubes are being, this material is being rebroadcast on free-to-air television. So ACMA didn't act. I have corresponded with them as to why they haven't acted. They said that it's within their powers to initiate their own investigation into such matters, which are deeply in the public interest, but they chose not to. And they've pointed me, and I think through all of you, therefore, to the fact that it's a matter for the Parliament to change the laws governing the Broadcasting Services Act, which establishes ACMA, to enable it to do the job for the Australian people that YouTube instead have had to do instead. I conclude on this, Senators. It's not just this controversy concerning this critical matter of the fair and balanced and factual reporting of public health information. This is one giant snapshot into a much wider cancer in our democracy. We've seen recently with the Four Corners program the use and abuse of non-disclosure agreements in dealing with accusations of sexual harassment within News Corporation around the world, and the fact that people like Gretchen Carlson have said that she can't speak about these matters because of the enforcement of NDAs. Well, the question again for News Corporation, if they're fine and upstanding citizens, is how many of these exist? And as Gretchen Carlson has asked, why can't they be lifted so that she can speak? And finally, of course, it's not just what happens in Metro Australia, it's what the News Corporation media monopoly have done across regional Australia. I've spoken already about regional television now having Sky content, but the action by News Corporation in shutting down 116 local newspapers on the cover of COVID last year was a disgrace. And the pressure and pricing pressure they've now applied to a local community newspapers trying to set up as alternative sources of news is equally obscene. And what has happened in Mackay, with Mackay Regional News attempting to step into the shoes of the Mackay Mercury, which was shut down by News Corporation, having been established way back in 1866, is one of 100+ examples across this country where the predatory practices of News Corporation and their use of pricing policies in particular are being used to quash the emergence of even local community voices as an alternative. So my concluding submission, Senators, is these, together with the other matters contained in my original submission, in my judgment, create a case as to why the Senate should recommend in favour of a royal commission into the future of media diversity in this country. The lifeblood of our democracy, I believe, is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. I'll first go to Senator Carr.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Rudd. Look, you referred to the correspondence that you've had with ACMA and their flat-footed approach to dealing with the Sky News After Dark incidents on YouTube. I have, with your, I have copies of that correspondence, which I wish to table for the committee's consideration. If I could do that, yep. Madam Chair. It's, Mr Rudd, look, can you just go through what's actually occurred in regard to the correspondence that you sent to ACMA on the 5th of August and the response that ACMA's sent back to you the 31st of August, which is the two documents I've tabled today?
Thank you, Senator Carr. A very brief summary is that after the news was publicised that YouTube had acted on a second strike policy basis, that Murdoch Sky News Australia was in breach of their COVID disinformation policy on multiple counts. The question occurred in my mind as, well, what on earth has the regulator been doing? Why were we depending on a private company to do regulators' business? And that's why I wrote to ACMA. ACMA then, in their correspondence, which you've just circulated, outlined their procedures for handling any complaints they receive, which essentially goes to it being a co-regulation model with the private sector, with media proprietors. Secondly, voluntary codes of conduct being delivered and produced, which third, if there is a breach, then ACMA will turn it back to the individual private media outlet for them to take appropriate action. And only fourthly, if that doesn't occur, will ACMA itself intervene. And ACMA's teeth at the end of the day are very substantial, including the withdrawal of a licence if necessary. Why this became relevant, Senator Carr, as you know, is that ACMA's regulatory powers extend to free-to-air television. And at the point at which ACMA, a point at which free-to-air television began broadcasting the Sky content, it was then captured within this regulatory framework. Prior to that, because Sky was a digital platform, it did not fall directly under ACMA's powers. In fact, it existed in a no man's land between the Press Council on the one hand and the Australian Communication Media Authority on the other. Their response, though, to conclude, Senator Carr, was this. We've received some 34 complaints over time about Sky television content. Secondly, we are in the process of looking at it. Thirdly, they gave us an example of where, in matters of great public interest, they could have self-initiated an inquiry. But quite plainly, in this case, they chose not to. But to conclude, Senator, I find the conclusion of their letter to me most instructive. If the Parliament wants us to have more powers in this matter, then the Parliament needs to give us those powers. I regard that as a request for the members of Parliament, and I think through the Parliament to this committee, to consider whether ACMA's powers are adequate. In the absence of a change to their statute, I think ACMA is useless, and this is a case study of how it's useless and should be abolished, and a Royal Commission should be established to recommend an alternative body.
Just a minor, I note there was 37 complaints that referred to in the letter, but it doesn't change the substance of any way what you've said. So in your submission that this actually supports the need for a Royal Commission. Now, you've heard from Mr Whittaker that the opponents of that proposition are suggesting that the fact that we now have so many other providers as a result of the convergence or the technology convergence has meant that we don't need a Royal Commission. There's been 9 media inquiries to date. What do you say to that proposition? Is that a reason to repudiate the submission from the 500,000 Australians that have petitioned the Parliament?
Senator Carr, my own view is that the core reason we need a Royal Commission is because in Australia, and perhaps most Australians are unaware of this, we have the highest concentration of print ownership for a modern democracy in the world. It is atypical and abnormal what we have in Australia. That's the core point here. The second point is this, that because of what the Murdoch media empire is now doing through Sky, it has not just extended that reach into the digital domain and through a whole range of its own digital platforms. It's now rebroadcasting that through major outlets like YouTube. And thirdly, through a new arrangement from 1 August this year, rebroadcasting through the existing commercial television networks across regional Australia. In other words, the media concentration in Australia is getting worse. There's one further point as well, Senator Carr, and that is, when you look at what's happened with the closure of 116 local newspapers, which Murdoch bought with hand on heart saying they would expand when they took them over from APN back in 2016-17, they've done exactly the reverse. They've shut them down and tried to migrate some of that online, but ultimately killed local news. Put all this together, it actually is deeply unhealthy for the democracy. And finally, where you see the Murdoch-Sky model at work, it is precisely derivative of the Murdoch-Fox model in the United States in terms of creating a captured audience of people from the far right, put them in an echo chamber, feed them raw meat, describe anything else which challenges their worldview based on the facts as a global left-wing conspiracy, to make a mozza of money out of it in the process, but then most critically, become this force in Australian politics which captures the right wing of politics, in our case, the Liberal and National Party, and pushes them further to the right. And in the case of the left wing of Australian politics, campaigns viciously against them on a continuing basis without any attempt at factual balance in the reporting. For all those reasons, it is at least worth a Royal Commission being empowered to look at the evidence of what's happened, to be in a legal position to call Lachlan Murdoch to actually answer questions rather than being allowed to evade them, and then to come up with recommendations of what is a fair and robust media regulatory model for the future of Australia, given our current regulators have failed.
So can I just come back to this point? Sky has been operating on a regional basis for 3 years, although I note on their own website that they claim that's only been from this year. That's their assertion, but my understanding it's actually been operating much longer than that. Is that your understanding, that there's been a period of greater engagement with WIN TV and other regional providers?
My understanding, Senator, is that from 2018 there was an arrangement with one of the regional broadcasters, and as of 1 August this year it was broadened considerably.
That's right. And that just adds to the point of why, or trying to come to some understanding why ACMA hasn't acted earlier. Now, is it your contention that there would need a further regulatory review in terms of the way in which the Parliament responds to the online services that are actually currently operating in this country?
Very much so, Senator. In our democracy, all of our citizens depend on a free, fair and balanced media to access the information in order to make informed political decisions. Whether you are from the left or from the centre or the right of Australian politics, or any democracy's politics. And the truth is, given media convergence across platforms from print to digital to classical electronic, radio and the rest, what we need is an increasingly uniform set of regulatory arrangements, rather than those we've inherited from the past. The Press Council regulates, as an industry-only regulatory body, the guidelines for Australian print media, and it is, I think most commentators would agree, an utterly toothless tiger. ACMA was established to regulate the Australian broadcasting media, and as demonstrated by this case in terms of public disinformation on public health, has been demonstrated to be a toothless tiger as well. For the digital platforms, there is a voluntary digital code, as I understand it, by which News Corporation have themselves exempted themselves and said that in fact they will adhere to Press Council guidelines to govern what they should do. So there's this great, as it were, hole in the middle. Therefore, purely in terms of where the media is today, which is across all these diverse platforms, we need common principles, a common regulatory environment which ensures fair, factual and balanced reporting so that the democracy stays alive and doesn't head down the American road, which frankly scares the living daylights out of me.
So that brings me to the question about the delivery method. Your government was responsible for the initial building of the NBN. Is it your view that the NBN has what is the role of the NBN into the future in terms of media diversity, and whether what is your view as to what position the public should have in regard to the NBN into the future?
The National Broadcasting Network, Senator, was established in order to lay out the railway network of the 21st century, to give all Australians connectivity, whether you were rich or poor, country or city, so that you could be fully wired. That is, if you were living in Untitled, whether you were running a small business in the suburbs of Mackay, or whether you were a small regional hospital in Burnie, that you would be able to have 100 megabits plus per second through fibre optic cable to the individual premises, to be fully accessed to online learning, health services and information to sustain and grow your small business, and, Senator, to have access to news. Secondly, as we know, after the government changed at the end of 2013, the Abbott government killed that model and substituted fibre optic to the node for fibre optic to the premises, leaving copper in the ground for the last link, which slows down the entire system. Thirdly, therefore, the NBN is incomplete, as all Australians have discovered through COVID, when suddenly they become dependent comprehensively on broadband to live and work and have their being, from ordering the groceries to accessing entertainment to online learning and, critically, health services as well. My judgment, therefore, is the NBN should remain in Australian public ownership until such time as we complete the missing link, which is fibre optic to the premises. That is critical if we're going to wire everybody, and critically provide everybody with another source of diversity in terms of access to alternative media platforms on fact and on opinion.
We've had a submission from Per Capita, I trust that has been sent to you, which basically argues that all media content will be delivered over broadband technology sooner rather than later, with the exception of shortwave radio for emergency services, and that a publicly owned wholesale broadband distribution platform could radically democratise the distribution of media content in Australia. Do you think there's a role to be played for the NBN in ensuring media diversity in this country?
Senator, I think there is potential for that. One of the reasons I've called for a Royal Commission is this involves enormous complexity, given the dynamics of convergence that we've spoken about before, the centrality of the internet to all converging platforms, frankly, and thirdly, the absence of a current regulatory environment to govern free, fair and balanced content across the country. Therefore, the backbone to provide it, that is through the NBN, becomes critically important. But I believe a properly empowered and professionally equipped Royal Commissioner could provide a series of recommendations as to what role the NBN should provide within that framework. I go back to my answer to your previous question, however. I do believe that the NBN should now remain in public ownership for a range of purposes.
Thank you. And just my final question, Madam Chair. The Channel 9 newspapers today are covering a story about a new campaign that's being launched by News Corp and Sky on climate change. What's your response to that suggestion that there would be a campaign from on high to affect all outlets for the News Corp empire?
Well, Senator, I think it's just a case of greenwashing. News Corporation, the Murdochs have been out there campaigning against climate change action for more than a decade. We've seen this one election campaign after another. Leopards don't change their spots. If anyone doubts what I've just said, remember what Rupert himself said when he said that climate change should be greeted with great scepticism. And when you look at his the representatives on Sky, for example, which we've just been talking about, Rowan Dean saying that climate change is the biggest hoax of them all. Saying again, only this year, there's been no net warming in the last 22 years, news to me and to the CSIRO and every credible climate scientist. And Alan Jones, the archdeacon of climate change denialism, saying they peddle the climate change hoax that apparently carbon dioxide, the source of all plant life, is evil, unquote. So therefore, given that's what they actually put out, we've got to greet this with enormous scepticism. I use the term greenwashing deliberately. What they're trying to do, that's why they've obviously leaked the story to Fairfax, as you described them, and Fairfax as I described them, but Nine as they now describe themselves, is to say to, shall we say, a certain part of the media market, aren't we fine fellows? We finally decided to green ourselves up by supporting carbon neutrality by 2050, while at the same time unleashing the dogs of war, some of whom I've just named, across the mass media market to continue to fuel fear in the community about any government or alternative government which proposes to take substantive climate change policy action. That's the real nature of the game being played here, Senator. I think most people who follow these matters closely would see it in a similar light.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Carr. Senator Faruqi.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Rudd. Mr. Rudd, a few weeks ago, you shared an excerpt from a Guardian Australia story where I spoke about being racially abused by Sky viewers following a segment on Paul Murray's show about me. And you said this: of course, an audience that's fed toxic far-right extremist politics is more likely to send threatening racist emails. Many people who are attacked by Murdoch then receive threatening messages. It's dangerous. I'm just interested in any reflections you might have on the impact of Sky's extremism on people's experiences of racism and bigotry. And do you think there's any appetite at all for News Corp to acknowledge this? And if not, why not?
Senator Faruqi, thank you for the question. I noticed carefully Mr Whittaker's response to this matter when you raised it just before, which was to put hand on heart and say, I'm very sorry. But secondly, if you look at their actual operationalisation of their editorial policy, do nothing about it. It's analogous to the point I've just made in response to Senator Carr on their attitude to climate change. Pretend to be concerned while still unleashing the dogs of war. Senator, what I've observed in the United States, where I've lived for 6 of the last 7 years, is through the Sky model, which is Murdoch's Fox network in the United States, that what we've seen are the politics and reporting of racial hatred going through the roof. And as a consequence of that, we have a much more difficult set of political realities on the ground in America than would otherwise be the case. It goes back to what I said before about the Murdoch-Fox, Murdoch-Sky news formula, which is capture a particular segment of the media market, then ensure that they are quarantined and fed raw meat from the far right, climate change denialism, various forms of, shall I say, racist abuse, then tell that group that anything they hear to the contrary is simply far left propaganda. And then, once having captured them, they turn them into a business model and, as a consequence, hold that in their hands as a mechanism, as a battering ram, in particular, to influence the centre-right and far-right of American politics. And hence what we've seen of those views through the Trump phenomenon capture the old Republican Party, and the grand old party, the Republican Party, was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It's now being captured by this beast. And the Fox media empire has had a deeply instrumental role in doing that. What causes me fear in Australia, Senator, is the same model that will therefore be applied here. We are simply some years behind where it will go to. But I am concerned about the legitimisation of racial stereotyping and racial hatred through Sky. To give one further example of this, Senator, most recently there was a cartoon infamously published in Murdoch's other news platform, the Australian newspaper, by Leak, the cartoonist. I lodged a formal objection with the Press Council on this, and the cartoon in question made a mockery of the colour of the current Vice President of the United States, then Senator Kamala Harris. Surprisingly to me, the Press Council found in my favour and against News Corporation. What was the response? A bit like their response to being repudiated by YouTube over their coverage of their disinformation on the pandemic. The entire Murdoch apparatus in Australia was then thrown at, discrediting the Press Council's finding against the Leak cartoon, despite it having been a racist cartoon. Just like the entire news apparatus of the Murdoch empire in Australia has been thrown at, the determination by YouTube to label 23 plus of their videos as being flagrant medical disinformation and dangerous to public health. And just like they unleashed the other day against the ABC, when they had the temerity to report Gretchen Carlson's evidence from the United States about the use and abuse of non-disclosure agreements by the Murdoch media empire to prevent women journalists from speaking out publicly about their experience within that organisation on the receiving end of sexual harassment. It's a standard pattern of behaviour. Therefore, will they change? My argument, Senator, is I don't believe they will do so voluntarily. They'll only do so if they are compelled by the weight of Australian public opinion, but also reflected through the deliberations, the evidence, and I believe the conclusions of a Royal Commission looking at this properly and objectively.
Mr. Rudd, just recently in the Saturday paper, you wrote an opinion piece. And in that opinion piece, you said that Murdoch keeps Sky News viewers in a far-right echo chamber where they are radicalized and taught to revile their cultural enemies. And I think you have spoken a little bit about this, but who in particular are these cultural enemies? Is it people like you and me? And, why is it so dangerous to have this echo chamber?
Well, let's call it in these terms, Senator, the meta-narrative underpinning this particular far-right attack in the United States, but also globally, and faithfully reported on Murdoch platforms, could broadly just be described as the extinction movement. What's the extinction movement all about? Its core argument is that white folks like me, if you like, are slowly being extinguished in terms of the mainstream politics of the United States, mainstream society as well. And it's been taken over by a whole range of hostile multicultural forces. And therefore, as a consequence, it's important for white folks to fight back. That's the essence of this appallingly far-right, extremist, racist view of politics. But if you peel back all the layers, that's actually what's at play here. And you see it slowly but surely creeping into far-right politics in this country as well. And I fear for the future of our multicultural society as a result. I fear for our ability to accept as a mature democracy, as we've done in the past, under successive Conservative and Labor governments, that diversity was a great thing for the future of our country. But now diversity under this particular debate is becoming a dirty word. That's where I fear it goes. And through the echo chamber, it provides more raw meat for this far-right constituency, and I fear where it then goes to in the future. A question before was asked about neo-Nazis, about which I found again Mr. Whittaker's responses at best equivocal when he asked for it to be defined what a neo-Nazi was. Well, for God's sake, I think most of us would know what a Nazi and a neo-Nazi is. It's all about the essential politics of race and the supremacy of one race against another. That's what it's about. And that's why I am passionate about this question as it affects Indigenous Australians and Australians of non-Anglo-Celtic background as well, even though I'm 100% Anglo-Celt myself.
Since you gave evidence to this committee in February, Mr. Rudd, a lot more has happened, not least the Sky YouTube ban and the Four Corners investigation, which you referred to earlier as well. Has News Corp's response and approach to being held accountable or not accountable for its journalism surprised you?
Senator, nothing has ever surprised me about News Corporation because they regard themselves as a law unto themselves. If we stand back from it all and the discussion we're having today, what's kind of the reality here? Murdoch, through News Corp, basically believe they run this country. They've got a media monopoly. They can tell the far right of Australian politics what to do. They can do their damnedest to keep the centre-left from ever forming a government in this country. And they are utterly unaccustomed to being held to any form of account. We've seen before, through our discussion today, press councils are toothless tiger, by and large, occasional exception. ACMA, they abandoned the field on the question that we've been discussing on YouTube just now. And in fact, there being no effective digital governance code, which would normally capture the operations of Sky in the first place. So therefore, we find ourselves where the News Corporation entity believes they can just swagger through, bluster their way through discussions like this and Senate inquiries like this, because ultimately they control the shots. Further point, Senator, is this. Most politicians I know in Australia, of both the left and the right, live in fear of what News Corporation can do to their careers. They can literally crucify you. They run a one-week-long campaign against something that you've said or alleged to have said, and their objective is to destroy you if you become a person who dares challenge their standing. That's the nature of the beast we're dealing with. Therefore, I've seen no indication on their part that they intend to change their modus operandi, with one little exception. And Senator Carr asked this question before. This little exercise in greenwashing that we see unfolding in terms of aren't we a bunch of good guys? We've decided maybe, subject to Mr Whittaker's dissimulation today, to embrace a bit of carbon, mid-century carbon neutrality, just to show that we're no longer total climate change denialists. But that's the varnish. The core of the beast hasn't changed. It is essentially a protection racket, extended to the Liberal and National parties in particular. If you don't do what we say, we'll knock you over. Ask Malcolm Turnbull about that. Or look at the testimony of individual members of Parliament like Ted O'Brien, who says dealing with these branch members every day is like dealing with somebody who's just had a combination of Peter Credlin and Alan Jones in their living room. It pushes the whole agenda to the far right. They're used to that. They're comfortable with that. But guess what? The people are speaking through the petition, through other forums, and the people of Australia are saying enough's enough. And when you hear Whittaker, for example, today, blame faceless algorithms operating out of California as being the root cause of our problem here, as opposed to, frankly, the well-known face of a foreign billionaire living in New York dictating our national future, let me tell you where I think the real problem lies, and that's with the Murdochs themselves. Hence why Lachlan has chosen not to appear today.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'll go to Senator McMahon.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rudd. Mr. Rudd, have you issued any show cause or commenced or in the process of commencing any legal action against Sky News or its parents or any subsidiaries?
Well, Senator, on a regular basis, when I'm defamed or believe I've been defamed by any media outlet, I would initiate with an initial statement of legal claim. Some time ago, the Murdoch media empire through Sky and Andrew Bolt made a series of claims concerning my position on the origin of the COVID-19 virus from Wuhan in China. As a consequence of that, I instructed my lawyers to write to Whittaker to indicate where I believe I'd been defamed and to seek their response. The matter has not gone to court. That's an accurate description of where we stand. And that's what I would do if I was defamed by any media outlet. I've done so with Fairfax before. I've done so with the ABC before. I'll do so with any news platform which defamed my reputation.
So, Mr. Rudd, based on that you have written to them, giving them notice that you may seek legal action, is it not true then you stand to benefit legally and financially from appearing before this inquiry here today?
Come on. Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, point of order, Senator Carr. Just hang on a second, Senator McMahon. A point of order has been raised.
That's totally inappropriate to put a question like that to the witness.
That's not a point of order, Senator Carr.
Totally inappropriate.
It's not for you to determine what's appropriate.
That's why I'm raising a point of order, Senator. It's up to the chair to make that deliberation, but that's a totally inappropriate question to put to this witness.
That's not your call, Senator Carr.
Senator McMahon, I take Senator Carr's point of order, and we have to be careful that you're not asserting motivation to witnesses. They're here under our invitation and our direction. This committee asked Mr. Rudd to appear, so it is up to this committee.
Yes.
If you've got a complaint to make about the witnesses that a committee of which you are involved in has, then we can take that offline. Mr. Rudd, you don't need to answer that question. It's out of order.
Then, Mr. Rudd, I would ask, do you believe that you have any conflict of interest in appearing here today?
None whatsoever, Senator. Firstly, when I originally put in my submission to this particular Senate inquiry, that predated by 9, 10 months, 6 months, a large number of months anyway, the current matter, which was really only a matter of some weeks ago in relation to Bolt and the Sky News program. So secondly, it's the point which Senator Hanson-Young has just mentioned. Here's the letter of invitation from you, the committee, asking me to appear. I didn't ask to come back. You asked me to come back. Thirdly, what I find interesting, and particularly the comment made before by Senator Anik, I'm sure we'll be jumping on the same bandwagon soon, is that the only people who have known of the legal action which I've initiated against Sky News over the Bolt matter, were myself and Mr Whittaker. So Mr Whittaker, I assume, or his staff have briefed Senator Annick and yourself about the nature of this legal action. I find that quite interesting, because I can assure you on the record here, I haven't briefed Senator Annick, nor yourself about this particular action at all. So that would suggest to me there's been some discussion between representatives of Sky News and Senator Annick, and possibly yourself, given Senator Annick's earlier intervention on this matter.
Mr Rudd, I would just like to clear that imputation against myself. I raised the matter because of a question that was raised earlier by Senator Antic. So I have not been briefed by you. I have not been briefed by Mr Whittaker. I merely raised it because it was raised by Senator Antic, and you have in fact confirmed the information that was raised by Senator Antic. Anyway, we shall move on. Mr Rudd, you recently, a couple of days ago, replied to a tweet by Corey Bernardi. Corey tweeted that ivermectin shall set you free. You replied that Murdoch host Corey Bernardi continues to undermine vaccines by advancing the far-right conspiracy theory that dark forces are hiding the supposed real cures for COVID-19. Mr Rudd, why did you reply in that manner to Corey Bernardi's tweet?
Well, I have an old-fashioned view, Senator, which is I actually believe in science. I also believe we have properly constituted scientific authorities. I believe that those properly constituted scientific authorities on matters of public health are A, the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer, and B, the Chief Medical Officers of the states and territories. I've also been quite assiduous in looking at precisely what they have said on the status, not just of the drug you've just referred to, but others, which I would put in the broad category of quack medicines. I've also referred to the fact quack medicines when it comes to the treatment of COVID-19. I've seen also the chief medical officers of the Commonwealth and states, in particular the states, reflect similar views. And therefore, I think it's just my responsibility as a citizen of Australia to push back against any statement by any far-right person or any other person who is challenging the science about these quack medicines on the one hand, as opposed to a proper receipt of the normal series of vaccinations on the other. I think it's the responsible thing to do, Senator.
So, Mr Rudd, I'll just point out to you that in Mr Bernardi's tweet, he did not actually mention anything about COVID-19. Now, are you aware of the use and benefits of ivermectin?
Senator, I know that we are currently in the middle of a pandemic. Secondly, it's called COVID-19. And thirdly, there is a debate about these two particular drugs that have just been referred to by yourself. And under those circumstances, therefore, as night follows day, when you have an individual such as Corey Bernardi out there promoting one particular treatment, it falls within a much broader context of the campaign waged by some through Sky Television in particular, advocating these as treatments for COVID-19. That forms the basis of my response to Senator Bernardi, who I don't regard as a scientist on these matters. I back uniformly the expert opinions of the chief medical officers, and therefore when people go out there directly or indirectly advocating alternative medical treatments, I will use my voice to back science against what I've described as quackery any day of the week.
Well, Mr Rudd, you didn't answer the question, so clearly you're not aware of the uses and benefits of ivermectin, and I did not in fact mention two drugs. I only mentioned one, which was ivermectin, which was the subject of Mr Bernardi's tweet. And you may be therefore surprised to know that ivermectin has been used for many years all around the world to treat many conditions.
Horses.
In livestock.
You're a vet.
Pets,
It's used for
and
horses.
Humans. Excuse me, Senator Carr. I'm speaking. You'll be quiet.
Yeah, order, Senator Carr, Senator McMahon, but let's also I just want to be clear. We do have a responsibility as elected officials not to harm the community. So let's just be clear about what questions we're putting forward.
Please let me finish, Chair. My line of questioning is that you're obviously not aware that ivermectin has been used all around the world for many years to treat billions and billions of livestock, pets, and humans. And in fact, it has treated many billions of people who had conditions that were previously untreated, conditions like onchocerca, elephantitis, scabies, strongyloides, leishmaniasis. These conditions are all treated by ivermectin. Many of these conditions were previously, prior to the discovery of ivermectin, considered untreatable. It led to the misery and suffering of billions of people. Therefore, in light of this, and the anniversary of the Nobel Prize being awarded for the discovery of ivermectin, Mr. Bernardi's tweet that ivermectin shall set you free is in fact quite appropriate. It has been taken by yourself completely out of context. And I can tell you, sir, that it has certainly set many thousands of people in my home of the Northern Territory free of the debilitating disease of scabies. So I would suggest that you have actually taken this tweet quite out of context without being aware of the many great benefits throughout many years of ivermectin across many species and many diseases. COVID-19 is not one of them, but Mr. Bernardi did not ascertain that in his tweet.
Well, Senator McMahon, you know perfectly well that former Senator Bernardi was referring to ivermectin in terms of setting people free in the broad context of the current debate about effective treatments of COVID-19. You know that, I know that, and this is what I describe as an exercise in semantics in order to somehow let Bernardi wriggle off the hook. He's part and parcel of a broader Sky News operation, which is constantly at the fringes of, or in the centre of, the promotion of quack medicines. And in this case, inferring that horse medicine could be used for humans in the current environment concerning COVID-19 is just plain irresponsible. You know that, I know that. That's why I spoke up about it.
I just to clarify, Mr. Rudd, you may not have heard the evidence from Mr. Whittaker, but Mr. Whittaker himself accepted that it was inappropriate and asked for it to be deleted.
Yes, I did not hear that, Senator.
Senator
Mr.
McMahon.
Rudd, my concern is that you are demonising a drug. All right, you disagree about the context in which Cory Bernardi used it. I don't see COVID-19 anywhere in his tweet. I believe his tweet was referring, as I said, to the awarding of the Nobel Prize for the discovery of this drug. I think we need to be careful that we don't get caught up in demonising a drug that has done so much good for so many billions of people around the world.
Senator, what about those people who have taken ivermectin on the basis of this broad advocacy, which they've heard through Murdoch platforms in the United States, and I fear in Australia, with adverse health consequences for themselves in an attempt to treat themselves to prevent COVID-19 or to deal with it if they've already got it? There are many such reports. You know that, I know that. That's why I spoke out.
Okay. Senator Antic.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Rudd. I was interested in exploring this degeneration of the relationship between yourself and News Limited. Seems to have spiralled down since 2008. And I'm just interested, you've used some colourful language today. It doesn't sound like someone who's particularly happy with the treatment he's received. I'm not sure if you saw an article written by David Pemberthy in The Australian on the 28th of November last year, in which he detailed some of the interactions that he'd had with you over the years and some of his journalists at the Daily Telegraph had over the course of his time covering politics in that part of the world. Were you able to read that?
Mr. Pemberthy's written many articles about me over the years, Senator, and most of them have been colourful, not a lot of them terribly flattering. So this one doesn't really come to mind. I do note, though, Senator, that consistent with what the Murdoch media normally do, rather than answer the substantive matters, which is there a Murdoch media monopoly? Has it been abused in terms of its powers? And what its effect is on the democracy? That, like the Murdoch media operation, you now engage in questions of character assassination, your questions of me, rather than the debate about the issues themselves.
Well,
That's your freedom,
I haven't
that's
actually
your
got to the
prerogative.
questions yet,
You're a
Mr.
senator,
Rudd.
and that's
So-
what you've been tasked, it seems, to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid not. This is actually a question of an article that was reported, which made some statements about the manner in which you used to interact with journalists. They seem to suggest that you had a very good run with the press, and you've made some statements about News Corp this morning, and I think it's important in order to colour the evidence that you've given. One of the particular claims you made, so I'm reading straight from the article here, is that you had a protracted campaign of vengeance against Julia Gillard as payback for the 2010 coup, when he, that's you, would habitually refer to Australia's first female Prime Minister as, quote, that effing bitch, end quote, in an obscenity-filled background calls to journalists and editors tearing her down. It's a direct quote from the article. Is that an accurate representation of events?
Well, what I'd say to you, Senator, is that my own reflections on former Prime Minister Gillard are reflected fully and frankly in my autobiography, which deals with this period in Australian politics.
You have to help me out there. I haven't read it.
Could I say that Mr. Pemberthy, formerly the editor of the Daily Telegraph, and now basically a Murdoch apparatchik writ large, would be creative about any of his recollections of our previous conversations, because that's what he does. What I do record most clearly from my conversations, which were many with Mr. Pemberthy at the time, is when I commented to him one day why he had launched upon a character assassination of a particular member of Parliament on a particular day. No friend of mine, no colleague of mine, I can't even remember their politics. His swaggering response was, quote, because we can, unquote. The issue at stake here is the use and abuse of monopoly powers by media operations such as News Corporation. They use it, they abuse it, not just in relation to my side of politics. Ask Malcolm Turnbull, sir, about his being on the receiving end of the same.
So you haven't answered the question, though. Is it a factually accurate representation? It does colour your evidence.
Well, Senator, you can speak about conversations which Mr. Pemberthy reports that I've had with he or his editors some time ago. I cannot recall the context of those conversations. I cannot recall the detail of them. I don't intend, for the purposes of our conversation here, to go into them. I can recall what I took out as an impression from my engagement with Mr. Pemberthy was that solid, stark warning to all politicians, which is, we can do this to you if you misbehave, because we are who we are. And that goes to the direct thrust of the matters before this committee, which is media diversity, monopoly, and the abuse of monopoly power.
He says that in 2006 you rang him and said, I presume you saw that, in reference to an excruciating press conference Mr. Beasley had had earlier that day about Rove McManus and the death of his wife, and that you spent a good 5 minutes telling him that Beasley clearly wasn't well. Once again, I mean, this article is lengthy and it is detailed. I haven't had the good fortune of reading your autobiography, nor do I intend to, but can you clarify whether that's an accurate representation?
Well, Senator, you may learn something if you read the autobiography, because it actually contains within it an account of the failings of the Howard government prior to 2007, something which someone on your side of politics would, I think, benefit from, including taking us to an unnecessary war in Iraq. But on the broader question of individual content, of individual conversations between myself and individual journalists a decade ago, I don't intend in this discussion here today to comment on their accuracy or otherwise. What is at stake here is the question of whether or not we have the use and abuse of monopoly power. And what we've had, sir, from you today is you joining forces with News Corporation in this particular line of inquiry. Your original statement, Senator, questioning my bona fides to attend here because of my legal objections to a recent, in my view, defamation of myself by Andrew Bolt concerning the origins of the coronavirus, as somehow representing a conflict of interest and why I should therefore be here. I don't seem to recall you having declared to this committee or to the people of Australia that you're a regular guest on Sky News yourself, and that you regularly use that as a platform to advance your own political interests. Well, good luck to you, but if we're in the business of declaring conflicts of interest, then I think it would be good if you began right there.
Well, the beauty of this forum, Mr. Rudd, is that you, as a former Prime Minister, and I'll make that point, a former Prime Minister, do not get to ask questions of me, a current parliamentarian. So Well done, but that's not the way this format works, and you well know it. Is this not just simply a case
earlier question,
of
Senator.
a...
Responded to your earlier question,
order.
Senator. That's how I'll choose to do so.
Order. Senator Antic, another member of the government also wants to ask questions, so just if you could make this
one
your
last
last
question.
one.
Thank you. Is this not really just a classic love story, the falling out of love, one partner, one party simply becoming disgruntled and embittered and taking that cause on further down the track? It seems as though there's a fairly lengthy campaign here, and it'd be interesting to know why.
Well, Senator, as I've said on a number of times on the public record, my experience of News Corporation is that in the period after from the 2013 election to the present, it moved from being essentially a centre-right news organisation, which would, at times of federal and state elections, usually support Conservatives, but more often than not do so, but from time to time support either Labor oppositions or Labor governments, to a case where over the course of the last decade, the Murdoch media empire in Australia has viciously campaigned for the Conservative side of politics in 23 of the last 23 federal and state elections. That was not the case prior to 2010. News Corporation has changed. It has moved from the centre-right to the far-right. And its principal vehicle for doing so has been, frankly, what we now see unfolding through Sky Television. They are following the model they have used in the United States. I have seen what it has done to the American democracy. So you ask, why have I joined this campaign? In fact, had some role in leading this campaign in the last year or two. It's because Murdoch in this country has changed radically. If you speak with former editors, if you speak with former News Corporation journalists, many of whom have appeared before this committee during its last set of public sessions, they would agree with the same. That's the reason why I've engaged in this question. And that's why I believe whether you are a centre-right voter, a centre-left voter, or a centre voter, all of us in our democracy, those of us who love the Australian democracy, want there to be fair, independent, free and balanced reporting where fact and factual reporting is not conflated with opinion. The Murdoch script for the future, sir, is for opinion to become fact, and that's why we end up with the cancer on democracy that we now see.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Rennick, you don't have much time.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Mr. Rudd, are you familiar with Barry Marshall?
Well, Senator Rennick, you asked me curious questions last time about my role in politics 30 years ago in Queensland. Enlighten me, who is Barry Marshall? I've got no idea.
Barry Marshall received the Nobel Prize in 2004 for proving that stomach ulcers were caused by bacteria. And that one of the people that capitalised on his success was a guy by the name of Thomas Borody, who basically came up for a cure for that bacteria that has resulted in saving the lives of tens of thousands of people, and is an extremely distinguished gastroenterologist in Australia. Now, he works alongside a guy by the name of Robert Clancy, who's a distinguished immunologist, who in the 80s invented a vaccine that reduced acute bronchitis by 90%. He established a link between upper respiratory tract infections and the gut, hence why he works with Thomas Borody. Now, they also are in agreement with Wendy Hoy, who's a Queenslander who works at the University of Queensland, who's got an Order of Australia for her research into chronic diseases. All three of those very distinguished medical scientists believe that ivermectin does actually aid in reducing the impact of COVID-19. I'm not saying it does, I'm just quoting what those people are saying. And that is on top of the work by colleague Wagstaff from the Monash University, who about a decade ago proved that ivermectin inhibits the RNA virus, the COVID virus, from getting into the nucleus and replicating.
Just to be clear,
given
Senator, we've got to get to the question, Senator Rennick.
Okay, so the question is, I think you owe those people an apology for calling them quacks as to what their views are, given that they have got lifetime careers, extremely distinguished lifetime careers in their work, and to call them quacks, I think is an insult. Would you be prepared to retract your statement?
Senator, I have an old-fashioned view, which is I believe in the science. I also have an old-fashioned view that when we have chief medical officers who are responsible for reaching informed decisions on the application of the medical science to the public health of the people of Queensland, for example, where you are a senator, that we should listen carefully to what they say and act accordingly. I know for a fact I am not a scientist. I know for a fact that you are not a scientist. I know for a fact that Senator Annick is not a scientist, nor is Senator McMahon, notwithstanding her own lengthy presentation before on the virtues of the science as she described the potential applications of horse medicine to humans. But the bottom line is this. Our responsibility as a public figure in Australia is to back in what the science says, whether that's on climate science, whether it's on pandemic science. And when I see the Murdoch media empire backing treatments for COVID-19, for this pandemic, and given the fact that our chief medical officers radically oppose that advice, I believe I've got a public responsibility not to give it some partial tick on the way through, but to repudiate it comprehensively as a possible cure or treatment of this insidious pandemic. I've done that before by describing...
Sorry to interrupt you there, but I just need to correct the record. I talked to the TGA.
And Senator, I will do it again. It is quack medicine.
Order.
Okay.
Order.
Okay, sorry.
Senator Rennick,
Yes.
Senator Rennick, have you got a follow-up question?
Okay, my follow-up question is that the TGA, I talked to the TGA and I talked to a number of people in the government, in the health department.
Senator Rennick, have you got a question? Just to be clear, Mr Rudd has made it absolutely clear he is not a doctor, he is not a medical expert. Neither are you. So I'm just wondering what evidence you would like out of Mr Rudd.
Okay, then he shouldn't be calling people who are scientific doctors and experts quacks. Okay, is he prepared to retract the statement? That is my question, yes or no?
Senator, the term quack is spelled Q-U-A-C-K. It's been used to describe medicines and potions put together by charlatans to treat a particular condition. My view, backed up by the chief medical officer of this country, is that anyone who seeks to advertise these treatments as being effective against COVID-19 is engaged in quackery. They are quacks, for which I make zero apology.
So you're calling these people quacks, just to be clear?
He's not here.
I think my most recent response, Senator, to your question just now was fully clear.
Thank you, Mr Rudd.
So you've got no respect for science at all. Okay, that's all I need to know. Thank you.
Sorry, point of order, Senator.
No, I think our colleague has retracted, so we might as well press on.
Okay. Senator Rennick, just to be, have you finished?
I'm fine, thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, point of order, Chair.
Yes, Senator McMahon.
Point of order. Mr. Rudd has just said that I'm not a scientist. I would like that corrected for the record. I am, in fact, a scientist. And I also did not advocate using a horse medicine on humans. Ivermectin has many legitimate uses in human medical conditions. I would like that put on the record.
Okay, and to put on the record, COVID-19 is not one of them.
Correct.
Good. It is becoming a bit confusing what the government's position is on all of this, I must say. Mr Rudd, I've got some final questions and I know we've kept you over time. I'd just like to know, you've written to ACMA and raised your concerns about a number of the stories and incidents of disinformation. You understand the process when you write to ACMA and put in a complaint is that they then refer that matter to the broadcaster themselves. Have you had any response from Sky News in relation to your complaint?
Not that I'm aware of, Senator. As you described the process contained in the correspondence between myself and ACMA, that I think is accurate. That is, A, they receive a complaint from a member of the public, in this case myself. B, they refer it to the media organisation in question. C, they then act or don't act. And then D, it seems to me from the letter from ACMA that the ACMA then waits for the member of the public, in this case myself, to re-notify ACMA that nothing has happened in order to trigger a further round of activity by ACMA, if any at all. It strikes me as a bizarre process.
And in relation to the further deletion of other video content, we know that YouTube have deleted off their platform a number, and then Sky have self-censored, in Mr Whittaker's words, another 18. Do you have any thoughts as to why they may have done that?
My experience of the Murdoch media in general is that they will only act when they believe that finally the regulators are coming down against them. Finally believe that the regulators are coming down against them. And that they believe more broadly that their corporate reputation may then be at stake. So after the initial, as it were, finding by YouTube, they then must have initiated their own internal review of the rest of their product on this question of COVID disinformation. Given that we don't have a full and frank accounting of the process which Sky News then went into, we can only speculate on that. But I think, Senator, it goes to the broader question that when we have, frankly, regulatory ambiguity on this question, then we have ACMA saying that at best it has weak regulatory powers. To me, what the correspondence from ACMA suggests is the Parliament should reflect on how the Broadcasting Services Act can be amended to make those powers more robust, and the procedures, frankly, clearer, because ultimately the penalties available to ACMA are huge. They can withdraw someone's licence. It's getting from the complaint to that point, which seems to be lost in a Byzantine tunnel of obscurity, in which I think our friends from News Corporation seem to have become past masters at extinguishing the light.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. And just for clarification, you may not have been aware, but Senator McMahon is a trained vet, so that's probably her. That's why she took issue with your description.
I have a huge amount of respect for vets, and I thank you for alerting me to that. But furthermore, I also know that veterinary scientists will be the last one to provide definitive judgments on whether or not a particular veterinary medicine should be used for human purposes, particularly on a virus such as the one we're dealing with, COVID-19.
Thank you very much for your time today, Mr Rudd.
Can I point something out there that Professor Doherty, who received the Nobel Prize in 1996... Sorry,
Senator Rennick. Senator Rennick, you do not have the call. Thank you. We're finishing up here so that we can go and have a short lunch break. Mr Rudd, thank you for your time. And if there's other questions, if that was Senator Rennick on the line there, if you've got follow-up questions, of course, all of our witnesses can take questions on notice. Thank you very much, Mr Rudd.
Thank you very much, Senator Hanson-Young, and to all senators in this important committee's work.